When the Erfurt interview had been agreed upon between the two sovereigns, the Emperor Napoleon, although the Prince de Benevento Talleyrand was no longer a minister and had been replaced by Monsieur de Champigny, took both of them with him to Erfurt. Long accustomed to the prince's services, he could not dispense with him altogether under certain circumstances. He considered that this minister's skill in diplomatic conferences and his knowledge of his political views might be useful to him. If this imprudence towards a man who had acted badly to him and whom he had not allowed, and rightly so, to add to the Ministry of Exterior Relations to the dignity of Vice Grand Elector, and the post of Grand Chamberlain was often harmful to Napoleon, it may be said that the fault he committed in allowing Talleyrand to come to Erfurt was fatal to the emperor. At Erfurt, Napoleon specially employed Prince de Benevento Talleyrand in his confidential communications with the Emperor Alexander. I do not know whether the emperor was well informed of the nature of the nocturnal conversations which Talleyrand used to have with the Tsar at the house of the Princess of Turn und Taxis. After the theater, which the sovereigns visited almost every evening, what were these conversations? Prince de Benevento Talleyrand undertook to answer that question not only in his memoirs, but in his private conversations. Monsieur de Talleyrand used to come to the levee every morning at Erfurt. When everybody had left, Napoleon detained him. He spoke to him of his plans, of his views of the Ottoman Empire, of Spanish affairs, of the attitude which he wished to maintain towards the Emperor Alexander, of the advantages which he hoped to derive from his alliance with him, and of the gradual concessions which he proposed to make him. Prince Talleyrand admits that he had no scruples in betraying these confidences to the Tsar in their conversations in the evening. He thus prepared this prince for the communications which were to be made to him by Napoleon, warning him of the hidden purpose of the insinuations which would be made to him. Alexander used to speak at Erfurt of this ardent desire to visit Paris, of how pleased he should be to be present at the meetings of the Council of the State presided over by Napoleon, and to be able to initiate himself under such a master to the science of government. I do not know how far this wish was sincere. I heard the Tsar speak about it with apparent earnestness, but Talleyrand's revelations must have considerably modified the Tsar's wish to increase his intimacy with Napoleon. Admitting that this ex-minister did not envenom his master's confidences, it will easily be understood that this kind of confidences always touches on delicate matters which, when they are approached without mission and without being treated with the necessary opportuneness and circumspection, are liable to be wrongly interpreted and to produce deplorable effects. Prince de Benevento Talleyrand did not content himself with abusing Napoleon's confidence as regards Russia. He rendered Austria another service. Monsieur de Metternich, having been unable to procure an invitation to his sovereign to come to Erfurt, had remained in Paris, where he was kept by his functions as ambassador. The Austrian cabinet could not dispense with the presence of a representative at Erfurt. The Emperor Francis accordingly dispatched an envoyé there, bearing a letter of which the apparent purpose was to congratulate Napoleon on the occasion of his presence in Germany, and to reassure him on the justly suspected disposition of the Austrian cabinet. The real object of this mission being to find out what was going on at Erfurt and to try and gather what was being planned against Austria. The Baron de Vincent, whom the Prince de Benevento Talleyrand had already presented to the emperor at Warsaw under almost analogous circumstances, was, as we have seen, selected for this mission. He received orders to see Monsieur de Talleyrand and to listen to what he would tell them. The Prince de Benevento Talleyrand used to explain his secret relations with the Emperor of Russia and with the Austrian minister in a manner which is related below. It is difficult, however, to believe that they were totally disinterested on his part, although I have no proof of the price which Austria paid for such precious advice. As concerns the reward given by the Emperor Alexander, we may quote the following fact amongst other proofs of the Tsar's gratitude. In the course of one of the audiences which Napoleon accorded to the Prince de Benevento, and of which the latter made the use which has been seen, the emperor told him that in his private conversations with Alexander, the latter had come to speak of the eventuality of a divorce on Napoleon's part, and the necessity of his remarrying, and at the same time had indirectly offered him the hand of one of the Grand Duchesses of Russia. Monsieur de Talleyrand at once saw the advantage to himself that he could derive from this confidence. He congratulated the Emperor Alexander on the subject, and then skillfully seizing his opportunity said to him, "Sire, since your majesty is in so happy a matrimonial disposition, you will allow me to ask a favor. I have had the misfortune to lose my eldest nephew, a young man full of promise. There remains one whom I wish to marry with advantage, but there is no prospect of doing so in France. The emperor keeps all his rich heiresses for his aides de camp. Your majesty has amongst your subjects a family with which it is my greatest desire to ally myself. The hand of the Princess Dorothea of Courland would crown the wishes of my nephew Edmund." The Emperor Alexander, who had often declared his wish to be agreeable to the Prince de Benevento, at once promised him his assistance in the matter, and told him that it was his intention on returning to St. Petersburg to stop at the house of the Duchess of Courland, that he would take Edmund de Périgord with him, who, being at the time attached to the French embassy in Russia, had accompanied the Duke of Vicence Caulaincourt to Erfurt, that he would undertake that the Duchess would accept him, and that the matter might be considered settled. After the stories which Monsieur de Talleyrand has told himself with all particulars of what passed between him and the Emperor of Russia and the Austrian envoy at Erfurt, one would like to know what pretext he puts forward to justify his conduct. This is the pretext. Frightened by the dangerous progress in the power of Napoleon, Prince de Benevento had the patriotic inspiration to endeavor to check the impetuosity of his upward flight and to put obstacles in the way of the execution of his adventurous projects to bring him back to moderation. He pretended to believe that in arousing the vigilance of Russia and Austria in this matter, he would be rendering a signal service first of all to Napoleon and then to France and Europe. Such an apology reminds one of the excuses made by the unfaithful regimental treasurers, who, having been punished by the imperial government, posed before the government of the Restoration as victims of the empire, alleging in their justification that they had desired to starve the usurper and to reduce him to impotence by depriving him of the sinews of war. It was only much later that the emperor heard what had been the nature of Monsieur de Talleyrand's night conversations with the Emperor Alexander at the house of the Princess of Dern und Taxis. It was during his stay at Erfurt that the emperor heard the Convention of Sintra, by the terms of which the French army secured its return to France with arms and baggage conveyed on English vessels. The capitulation was an honorable one. However, much Napoleon was grieved by this issue to the expedition in Portugal. He showed no resentment to the Duke de Brentès, Junot, who was a brave and loyal soldier of rare courage and entirely devoted to him. The French army landed shortly afterwards at Rochefort. Monsieur de Bourmont, whom General Junot had found in Portugal, was amongst them. The commander-in-chief, in acknowledgment of the services which Bourmont had rendered in Lisbon, had asked the emperor for a post for him, which Napoleon had refused, and it was against his orders that the old Vendéan leader had followed the army. After the return of General Junot, complaints had been made to the emperor about the too great extension which the Duke de Brentès had given to the right of conquest in Portugal. Amongst other things, the seizure of the famous Bible at the convent of Belém. To understand the value attached to this manuscript by the Portuguese government, it is necessary to give a brief outline of its history. At the time of the discovery of the route to East India by the Cape of Good Hope, Vasco da Gama sent the King of Portugal, Dom Manuel, the first fruits of the riches of these countries, consisting in gold, pearls, and diamonds. According to the ideas current at that time, Dom Manuel thought it his duty to offer these first fruits to the Holy See. Julius II, who at that time occupied the pontifical chair, sent back in return a manuscript to the King of Portugal. This manuscript was remarkable for the perfection of its writing, the beauty of the vignettes, picked out with gold, for the magnificence of its binding and of its clasps, which were enriched with precious stones. This manuscript was a Bible with a commentary by Dom Thomas de Lira in 7 big quarto volumes. Dom Manuel had just founded a convent of Hieronymites at Belém, with all the magnificence which at that time was the lot of religious foundations. He had the work deposited there and placed it under the prior's care. The book was only shown, even in quite recent times, with the greatest circumspection. The monks were not allowed to part with it without an authorization not only signed, but entirely written by the king. General Junot, having heard this marvel spoken about and using the right of conquest, had it brought to him, promising to return it in 3 days, a promise which he forgot to keep. Events brought on the Battle of Vimiero and the Convention of Sintra, which stipulated for the evacuation of Portugal by the French troops. The prior of the Hieronymites made the English general interfere to regain possession of the Bible, and an officer was dispatched to General Junot to ask for its restitution. Junot alleged that the manuscript had been sent to France by the Aviso, which had informed the emperor of the Convention of Sintra, and expressed his regret at not being able to restore it. This Bible accordingly remained in Paris in the general's library. At his death, his furniture, pictures, and books were sold. The Bible was not included in the catalog and was reserved for sale by private treaty. A Frenchman who had lived 12 years in Portugal and who had returned to France was charged to write to the emperor, who was in Dresden at the time, to inform him of the matters related and to solicit his interference for the restitution of this Bible. The emperor wrote to the Duke of Rovigo, Savary, Minister of Police, on this subject, who took the steps prescribed by Napoleon. The wretched Duke de Brantes had died in consequence of a deplorable mental aberration. Out of interest for Madame de Brantes, left a widow and without fortune, and considering perhaps the time had, so to speak, legitimatized the possession of a booty taken in war, the emperor did not insist on the order of restitution which he had given. He was, moreover, much too busy to pay any serious attention to this matter, and it remained as it stood. The restoration came. Marquis de Palmeira, Portuguese ambassador to Paris, and Count de Funchal, Portuguese ambassador to Rome, took steps for the restitution of the precious manuscript. Count Funchal asked for an audience with the King Louis XVIII and obtained an order from him which obliged the Duchess de Brantes to restore the Bible. But in view of Madame de Brantes' precarious position, the king insisted that a sum of 80,000 francs, the sum at which the Bible had been estimated, should be paid to the Duchess. Thanks to this arrangement, the Bible, with the commentary of Dom Thomas de Lira, found its way back to the Hieronymites convent, where it is to this day. The poor prior of the monastery had been exiled for 3 years for having allowed himself to be deprived of this manuscript, in spite of the fact that he had been quite powerless to oppose it. On his return to Erfurt, the emperor only spent 10 days at St. Cloud. He heard there of the landing in Spain of the army of the Marquis de Romana, the invasion of which, from the Danish islands, where it had been in cantonment, had been announced to him in the preceding month of August. This event was calculated to increase the excitement of the inhabitants of the peninsula and to fortify the spirit of resistance which animated them. The preceding Spanish government, directed by the Prince de la Paix, Godoy, had, on the demand of the emperor, added a corps of 15,000 men to the French army in atonement for his hostile proclamation of October 3rd, 1806, about which we spoke in its place. This corps, the command of which had been confided to the Marquis de la Romana, was intended for the north of Germany, placed under the orders of the Prince de Pontecorvo, Bernadotte. It was charged with the defense of the island of Fionia. The Spanish general, hearing of what happened at Bayonne, conceived the design of leading his troops back to Spain and depriving the French army of their assistance, to add them as auxiliaries to the insurrection. With this purpose in view, he entered into communication with the English Admiral Keats, who was in command of the Baltic by the intermediary of a Spanish priest of Scotch origin, whose name was Robertson. He then set to work to collect his scattered troops by means of schemes plotted with great dissimulation on the points on the coast where the boats of the English transport were ready to receive them. La Romana had been able to inspire Bernadotte with such confidence that Spanish companies formed part of the bodyguard of the commander-in-chief. Thanks to orders supposed to emanate from the staff, he had been able to have marches executed by his troops on the longest days in the year, which should have aroused suspicion. Detachments dispersed in the islands of Fionia and in Jutland were in this way able to reach the island of Langeland, which had been fixed upon as a general meeting place without attracting attention. The Spanish troops who were nearest to Copenhagen and who had committed certain acts of violence were disarmed by the Danes. All the others were assembled within 3 days and embarked. During their passage, these troops put into port in England, where the English government armed and equipped them at the public cost. After a long sea voyage, General La Romana landed in the first days of October at Santander, with 9,000 men who went to swell General Blake's army in Biscay. The emperor left on October 29th to put himself at the head of the armies in Spain, to which several corps coming from Germany had been added. He only passed the night at Merak and rode thence to Vitoria, where King Joseph was staying. He spent 5 days in this town to give the soldiers time to come up, and devoted his attention to ensuring his communications and ordering military engagements in Biscay, Navarre, and Aragon. I left Bayonne on the morrow and rode at full speed to Vitoria to Monsieur Ivan, the emperor's surgeon in ordinary, leaving my carriage behind me. We were surprised to find at Vitoria the old foot grenadiers of the guard who had left Bayonne the day before and who had marched nearly 25 leagues in 2 days, laden like Roman soldiers. At Oyerson, the postmaster and his wife did us the excellent turn of keeping us back till daybreak, because armed peasants had been seen on the road at a distance of a mile from Oyerson. As it happened, we found a French officer who had been murdered lying by the wayside. Mondragon, through which we passed, had a festive air which quite reassured us. However, at different points along our route, we came across young conscripts placed on solitary sentry duty who were in a very nervous state of mind. At last, we succeeded in reaching Vitoria safely. I had had some small pistols sent on to me from Paris and carried them on me. When the emperor heard of this excess of prudence, he told me that I had acted wrongly, as it would make people think that he was in personal danger. But when I had told him about our journey, he did not blame my precaution any longer. It was, however, only necessary in the case of isolated individuals, for the safety of the emperor and of his household was never for a moment in danger. On November 11th, the emperor was at Burgos, after having fought an engagement on the outskirts of this town at which flags were captured, which Napoleon sent to the legislative body. The public establishments, the churches of this unhappy town, were all given up to pillage. The bivouac fire established in the bishop's palace where the emperor lived was stoked with broken bits of furniture. The officers warmed themselves at this, sitting round it on gilded armchairs. The abbey, which contained the tombs of the Cid and of Ximenes, received numerous visitors. It was situated outside Burgos. Monsieur Denon, with whom I went there, brought back with him one of Ximenes' teeth, which he placed in a reliquary in which he had collected together fragments of the mortal remains of many celebrated persons.